Welcome, everybody. Greetings and salutations. E. Spencer Kite, friendly neighborhood Spencer Man, back with another installment of the Fighters to Watch series here on SevereMMA's YouTube page. Thank you for tuning in. I hope thus far you have enjoyed it. It has been a pleasure to put together. We're into the back half of things now. We are going to talk about the welterweights today. That will leave us with three more divisions after this: middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight, of course. It has been a good time. We've gone through a number of fighters thus far. This is it's not the deepest collection in terms of numbers, but I think in terms of names and in terms of fighters that are prominent in the division already or in their place in the division, it's one of the most interesting. And so we're going to just jump right into it. As always, alphabetical order, not a hierarchy. It means we start with Sean Brady, who is 15-1 overall, 5-1 in the UFC, and coming off his first loss, where he was completely out-hustled, completely outclassed by Belal Muhammad at UFC 280 in Abu Dhabi in October. Throughout Sean Brady's rise, we have been high on him in terms of his upside, in terms of where he may be able to get to. Justifiably. Great grappler, good power, beat good competition all the way into that fight with Belal in October. The one question mark for me that was always there was the conditioning, because he seemed to tire in his fight with Michael Chiesa and in some fights previous to that as well. We saw that in the fight with Belal. We also now know that the nose seems to be a bit of an issue. It's kind of turning into a Rory McDonald nose, where it gets busted up every fight and then compromises the breathing, which then taxes the cardio and creates problems. He is scheduled to face Michel Pereira on March 25th, which is, to me, a really interesting fight. Obviously, two guys that are, Pereira on a nice winning streak. We'll get to him later. Brady looking to rebound. But it's a real tough assignment for a guy coming off his first loss. Some of it is that he is the higher ranked fighter, and so he carries that single digit next to his name. Pereira's on a nice run, needs to face somebody coming up. But I respect Sean Brady and his team for signing that contract. That is not a fight I would have taken. I would have found somebody else. So we'll see how that one works out, because we could, get into and reach the start of Q2 with Sean Brady, a guy that was undefeated up until the last quarter of last year, entering Q2 of this year on a 2-fight skid, where we're wondering where he fits in the division. I wouldn't have thought that 2 years ago or even a year ago at this time, but that's where we are. That's how quickly things can change in a division that is this competitive. Brings us to Randy Brown, 32 years old now, 16-4 overall, 9-4 in the UFC. He's won his last 4. Feels like a guy that is finally putting it all together. And I say finally, not from a like, oh my God, it's taken him so long. What took you so long? But from a like, kind of what we talked about earlier in this series, back with the bantamweights about Chito Vera. It takes time. It is a process. And so Randy Brown has been in the UFC for 13 fights. It's taken him 12, 13 fights to figure out, okay, I can use my kicks from range. I can use my length. I can grapple a little bit. I don't have to be super high volume, but I can be just enough. Like, we're seeing a good, maturing, developing fighter over these last bunch of fights. He's 6-1 over his last 7. The only losses to Vicente Luque, which we don't fault anyone for here, because Vicente Luque is terrific. He's looked really good. The challenge for Randy Brown, however, is that he is matched up with Jack Della Maddalena at UFC 284 in Perth. If he gets through that, terrific. He is into, in my opinion, the top 15 and facing some of these bigger names. We're going to find out in that fight where the ceiling rests a little bit more, or how much room is left to get to the ceiling, I should say, for each of these guys. It's a great fight. It's a really great matchup. Can't wait to see it. Next up, Gilbert Burns, 36 years old, 50-5. No, 20-5. Jesus, 50-5 would have been crazy. 20-5 overall, 13-5 in the UFC. 1-2 in his last 3, but the losses are Kamaru Usman and Khamzat Chimaev. To me, he's sort of like the welterweight bargain brand version of Dustin Poirier. in that he can kind of pick his shots a little bit. He's a guy that doesn't have to be in the title picture right now, but you can pair him off in some fun fights. That to me was what the Chimaev fight was. Yes, it was a test, but it was also just like, we need a name, and Gilbert Burns is a good name. I think that's why he was chasing the Masvidal fight. That fits that bill. He's facing Neil Magny next, which is weird to me because was just in there with Chimaev. And now he's facing Neil Magny, who lost to a guy that was, ranked behind him in Shavkat Rakhmonov last time out. And now he's getting a top 5 fighter. It's a weird fight. It gets both guys active. I'm happy to see Gilbert Burns back. I don't think he needs to be a contender. I don't think he needs to be in the title mix. I think he can find a nice spot for himself towards the top of this division, facing kind of whoever the UFC needs him to face or whoever he'd like to face, whether that's Masvidal, whether that's a guy we'll get to in a few fighters in Colby Covington, those sorts of fights. If he wants to face the up-and-comers and the UFC wants to use him against some more of these up-and-comers, great. Perfect test for them. Well-rounded, dangerous, the whole 9. But I don't think he needs to be there. I would rather see those contender spots and those fights to determine contenders go to younger ascending fighters than a guy like Burns, who has already fought for the title. We know where the top end sits, and he's not necessarily going to put a whole lot of improvements together as he's now 36. Next up, Michael Chiesa. Feels like he's in a weird place right now, in my opinion. He's 35 years old. He's 4-2 at lightweight, or at welterweight. Excuse me, that's the division we're in. But he's lost his last 2. Hasn't fought in over a year since losing to Sean Brady. Before that was the Vicente Luque fight, where he was looking good up until he made a mistake and got caught. I'm really curious to see both when he gets booked and who he gets booked against, because I think those things will tell us a little bit about where Chiesa is at in his career. He has made it perfectly clear over the course of his time in the UFC and subsequently his appearances at the UFC desk that is a piece of, the next stage planning that he wanted to get into, that he wanted to do, that he's really passionate about, really good at as well. And so I'm interested to know whether he's starting to transition. Or maybe has already and just hasn't, maybe he's done the Paul Felder thing and just hasn't said, I'm done, but is kind of quietly done. I've reached out to his team. I've tried to get him on a conversation with. I know Mike a little bit from talking to him over the years. I would love to have those conversations with him. If I can, I will tell you and I will get them set up and they will be here on the YouTube page. But we'll find out. We're going to see. This year is going to be a very pivotal year for him. I think he's probably accepted that the championship dreams aren't going to come true. And so now you've got to decide, do I want to keep fighting because I'm a competitor, because I want to keep doing this? Or are you ready to move into the next phase of things? And if you do still want to compete, is it the Tony Ferguson route or is it the Jim Miller route? I think we'll get an answer to all of those questions this coming year. Brings us to Khamzat Chimaev, 28 years old, 12-0 overall, 6-0 in the UFC. Undeniably a monster, right? Undeniably a bit of a juggernaut, but he's got some shit to figure out. The last fight, the last situation, supposed to be Nathan Diaz, ends up being Kevin Holland, misses weight, the whole 9. Doesn't look good. I don't care what the result was and how good he looked in the octagon itself. That situation is a bad look for a young, emerging fighter who's crowing all the time about nobody wants to fight me and bring on all of these. Figure your shit out. Pick a division, stick with it, be a professional, find opponents, get some fights, and let's go. Because the upside is there. The skills are there. I don't think there's anybody that covers or follows this sport that would tell you that Chimaev couldn't be a UFC champion. He absolutely could. He could be a champion before this year is out. He's that good. But if he's going to be this sort of diva and a little bit of a problem child, that's going to limit him. We kind of created this, right? He is the current Frankenstein's monster of the UFC, in that as soon as he beat John Phillips and Reese McKee, everybody was give him title shots, telling him he's the greatest. And when you get that and you're 26, 25, 26, and everybody's telling you how great you are, it's sometimes hard to not let that just go all the way to your head and think that you can get away with anything. We're going to find out how much he can get away with whenever his next fight is booked, because that stuff at UFC 279 surely did not go over well with the UFC. Curious to see what division he lands in and who the opponent is. If he's sticking at welterweight, I would love for his opponent to be this next gentleman, Colby Covington, who turns 35 in February, 17-3 overall, 12-3 in the UFC, which honestly seems a little light. Like, that's surprising to me that it's only 15 fights in the UFC. Nonetheless, he's coming off a win over Masvidal in the cage and a broken jaw in a fight with Jorge Masvidal outside of the cage that has kept him sidelined since that fight all the way back in March. To me, he's the bronze medalist in this division at worst. He was the silver medalist when he was, running neck and neck with Kamaru Usman for 2 fights. Could still maybe be gold. Wouldn't put it past him to beat Leon Edwards. Listen, Colby's personality, persona, complete asshole. Don't like it. Don't like him. It's a hell of a good fighter, though. There's no denying that. He's a guy that we need back. I made this case when we did the takeaways, myself, Harry, and Ian, that I miss Colby Covington as a competitor, as a guy that's around in this division and taking on some of these fights. I would love to see him face Khamzat Chimaev. Harry and I talked about it just outside of, hey, how do you think that would go the other day? And it's really interesting because Colby may be the guy that can hang with him wrestling-wise. And conditioning, he's got the gas tank to push. And you make that 5 rounds, and sure, maybe Chimaev comes out the gate really quick. But you get into rounds 3, 4, 5, Colby will still be there. Will Chimaev? We need to get him back. We need to see him again. He's too good. He's too talented to not be competing. I understand there's a lot going on, legal proceedings, health, all of those different things. I hope they get cleared up. I hope we get Colby Covington back. And I hope we get him back against Khamzat Chimaev. Mentioned him a little bit earlier, Jack Della Maddalena, the 2022 UFC Rookie of the Year for me, member of the Dana White Contender Series class of 21, 26 years old, 13-2 overall, 3-0 in the UFC. All of those are first round finishes. He's won 13 straight after losing his first 2 professional fights. He's one of the most exciting up-and-comers, not just in the division, but in the UFC as a whole. I love the varied striking. I love that he's willing to go in there and just jump into the fray. There's not really a whole lot of, it's not that it's chaos, and it's not that he's not feeling things out, but it's not the I'm going to take this round to make reads and not do much. He sets up at the start of the fights. If you go back and watch Della's fights, he tells guys when he gets into the cage, we're not touching gloves. And it's not a disrespect thing. It's not a I don't like you thing. It's I'm here to fight you. I'm here to beat you up. We can touch. We've shaken hands previous to this. We can shake hands afterwards. But right here, right now, we're not doing it. I'm going to punch you in the face. And he comes out and right away he looks to set a tone. And sometimes the first fight, it looked like Pete Rodriguez, where he just blows through him. Obviously, understandable. Made a couple mistakes in the Ramazan Emeev fight, where he got into some, not great spots. You don't want to be dicking around a little bit and feeling too comfortable on the ground against a guy like Emeev. Someone a little bit better than Emeev finishes that choke, and we're not talking about Della as Rookie of the Year. And then he came out and he just blasted Danny Roberts, which was a great performance. Mentioned earlier, facing Randy Brown in Perth, I think it's a good performance because Randy Brown has that length that he knows how to use. We will see lots of teeps up the middle. We will see lots of low calf kicks. We will see Randy Brown trying to force Della to stay on the outside, which means we're going to have to see how he gets inside. We're going to see if there is a little wrestling that he mixes in to take this to the canvas to neutralize that length a little bit. It's a great fight. I can't wait to see the reaction he gets at home in Perth. And I can't wait to see what he does for his sophomore season. Next up, Rafael Dos Anjos back at welterweight because he knows the road to gold at lightweight just isn't there for him, right? Prior to the loss to Rafael Fiziev, that was his mindset. That was his mission. I'm back down at 55. This is what I want to do. I'm pushing to try to win this title again. I think I can get back there. Let's see. Loses to Fiziev and says, okay, that's not going to happen. Go back up to 70 so I don't have to cut weight. And he goes out and he has a great performance against Bryan Barberena. Just an absolutely dominant performance against Bryan Barberena. And I think that is what we're going to see from RDA going forward. I mentioned Gilbert Burns being sort of the like pick your fight, little bit sort of not quite Dustin Poirier. I think Dos Anjos is similar. He should be the guy that is facing fellow veterans. So a fight with Burns, love it. Love to see it. Be great. Be all kinds of fun, I think. Two guys that used to be lightweights fighting up at welterweight, both really well-rounded, a little bit of power difference in there, good grapplers, great fight. Make that happen. I think it's going to be that. I don't think he goes back into sort of the championship chase queue because we've seen that already. Fought for the interim title, lost a bunch of fights to the ascending class. I'm sure he'll get one in there, one or two in the next few years, maybe against the ascending class. But for the most part, I think he's going to be facing the more established guys that are still there. So Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, Jorge Masvidal at some point, maybe Colby again, maybe Burns, as I said. It's a good fit for him. I'm happy he's still competitive. I enjoy watching him compete. He looked great against Bam Bam. Looking forward to the next one. Next up, the new champ, Leon Edwards, 31 years old, 23-1 no contest overall, 12-2 with that no contest in the UFC, undefeated in his last 11, found a way to pull it out at UFC 285. It was the knockout of the year. It was the comeback of the year. It was the maybe upset of the year in some regards because of the timing of it. It was a crazy performance. And he still feels real vulnerable as the champion. Harry and I were talking about this morning in terms of like perception-wise, who are the champions that maybe look like they're on the most shaky ground. And I said it was Edwards and Aljamain Sterling. And I talked about Aljo when we went through the bantamweights, right? No denying that he is the champion, but there hasn't been that truly dominant performance where you go, yeah, absolutely. He had good moments and good rounds against Petr Yan to win that second fight going away, or to win that second fight. To me, clearly it was a split decision, but still. And the fight with TJ Dillashaw, he did everything he needed to do to get the finish, to get the performance. But it's hard to really be like, oh yeah, he smashed TJ Dillashaw when TJ's fighting with one arm. Edwards is in a similar position. The finish of Kamaru Usman and handing him his first UFC loss, you can't take anything away from him. It's great. It's a beautiful performance. But the 3 rounds and 4 minutes and change, 4 minutes of the fifth that came before it weren't great. And so it's going to be really curious to see what he looks like when he defends his title in London. We don't know for sure that that's happening, but I would assume that that is what it's going to be. The interesting piece is we still don't know who it is. Usman seems to not be ready, seems to be dealing with a hand injury. We'll talk about that a little later, which means it might be Jorge Masvidal. And I'm going to tell you right now, I didn't include Jorge Masvidal in this series. He's not somebody I particularly want to watch. I understand making that fight. I don't want to see it. I don't care about it. 3-piece and a soda is so old now that it doesn't resonate with me anymore. It doesn't carry any value to me anymore. And if that is the fight that Edwards get, if that is the booking, Edwards needs to shine. He needs to go out and just there can't be any slip ups like there were in the Nathan Diaz fight. It needs to be that fight with Nate for the full 25 minutes, not 24, and then you get clipped. He's in an interesting spot. He has a chance this year to really solidify his standing, to really put a stamp on things and silence the people, including myself, that aren't 100% sure on the sturdiness of the throne he's sitting on. But we'll see. Brings me to Rinat Fakhretdinov, 31 years old, 21-2 overall, 2-0 in the UFC. Looked great against Brian Battle last time out. Ragdolled him. Kept him on the ground. Said, you can't get up? Cool. We're just going to stay here. The note I have down, and I'm looking at it again because it's like, yeah, this really feels right, is that he's a late arriving, late blooming Russian contender. So I think he's one of these guys at 31 with the amount of experience that he has that should probably just get hustled along the line a little bit quicker than maybe some of these other fighters that are under 30 that don't have as much experience. I don't think there's any reason to really slow play this. Now, I'm not saying throw him in there with a top 5 guy and let's see, but rather than bring him through sort of the Gabe Green middle of the pack guys, maybe get him in there with, I don't know, Santiago Ponzinibbio, Alex Morono, someone in that range, just outside of the top 15 that we know who they are and what they are, and see what he can do. We still need to see how he's going to hold up against stronger competition. He's done well against fellow inexperienced UFC fighters in terms of UFC experience. Let's get him in there because he's 31. He's got a world of experience in terms of overall number of fights. Get him in there. Let's test it. Let's see. Next up, Ian Gary, a guy we talk about a great deal here on SevereMMA, obviously for obvious reasons. 25 years old, 10-0, 3-0 in the UFC. For me, and this is strictly my opinion, not anyone else's here, this is the year where he needs to have a meaningful step up in competition just to see where he's at. Again, similar to Fakhretdinov, I don't mean that as great, let's get him in there with a top 5 opponent tomorrow, but let's get him in there with somebody that can push him, that we look at it and go, there's a good chance he loses. There's a reasonable chance he loses this fight. Because that's how we're going to learn more about Ian Gary. We're not learning things all that much from beating Darian Weeks and guys like that. He's getting valuable ring time. He's getting valuable experience being in the cage, and he needs that, and I understand it. But me as an analyst and me as an observer and a scout or whatever you want to call it, I need to see him against the guys that might be able to beat him. I need to see him against the guys that are going to push him, that are going to throw a bunch of stuff at him that he's got to make adjustments to, that he's got to figure out on the fly, not just him being the one dictating everything. He hasn't fought since July. He would be a really great fit on the London card in March. I don't know if that's going to happen. He and his wife just had a child a few months ago, so we're not sure sort of what his timeline, his desire to come back is. And another thing that this is one of those, I'm not 100% sure, and I would love some feedback. I would love to know. He might not be at Killcliff FC any longer with former Sanford. He may not be in South Florida, which would be interesting. I would love to know where he's training, who he's training with, what the setup is, whether that was just so that they could go home and have their child and he'll go back. Need to know. Great prospect, terrific prospect, still has tons of talent. Want to see a little more. Next up is Jake Matthews. And he probably should not be on this list. Excuse me, sorry. I probably shouldn't be holding out hope for Jake Matthews still. But alas, here we are. He is a guy that I cannot quit. He's only 28. He's 18-6 overall, 11-6 in the UFC, and 7-3 at welterweight, which is a good number. But then you remember that after the great showing against Andre Fiallo in Singapore, he has a not great showing against Matthew Semmelsberger last month. The talent is there. For me, it's an IQ and an understanding and an adjustment deficiency or shortfall right now. The reason I still can't quit Jake Matthews is because of what we saw, not only in the Fiallo fight, but even in parts of the fight with Semi. He's able to take some shots better. He lands well. He is a big, strong, athletic kid. And if he can work out a few of those little kinks, it feels like there's still room to grow. As always, I might be completely wrong. I might be reading too much into this. I started this with, he probably shouldn't be on the list. So I know that I'm looking at this probably through rose-colored glasses because I like Jake Matthews. I've talked to him since he was a 19-year-old making his UFC debut. That's almost a decade. You can't not kind of root for people when you've spent nearly a decade speaking with them. Going to be interesting to see who he gets matched up with again next time out. Probably be somewhere in the summer. If he has a good showing there, we'll go one direction. If he doesn't, I will be forced to fully abandon ship, get off the bandwagon, sell my place on Jake Matthews Island, whatever you want to say. But I'm not ready to do that yet. The fight, the performance against Andre Fiallo was just too good. Excuse me. Still fighting the cold a little. It's not even a cold. It's just an annoying, scratchy throat that I can't get rid of. Drives me crazy. Next up, Michael Morales, 23 years old, 14-0 overall, 2-0 in the UFC, both finishes. Contender Series grad from 2021. Good size, good length, looks the part. 100% looks the part of a guy that is going to have good success in this division, in the UFC as a whole, and may eventually work his way into the top 15. He was supposed to fight Fakhretdinov in December, was forced to withdraw, replaced by Brian Battle. So to me, I'd like to see a little bit of a slight step back. So he debuted against Trevin Giles, beat him. Was supposed to fight Ramiz Brahimaj in his next fight. Ramiz had to withdraw, fought Adam Fugit, who came up and took a short notice fight. Went into the third round. Morales gets the finish. It's a good win. But let's just keep him there. He's 23. He's 23. There's no need to rush this yet. There's so many talented guys and so much good, experienced, competitive fighters, so many good, experienced, competitive fighters, I should say, ahead of him that we don't need to rush this. It doesn't need to be, again, as I've been saying with some of these younger fighters, it doesn't need to be a top 10, top 15 guy next. It can be someone in that mid-range that is established, that we know who they are and what they bring to the table, and it will give us an opportunity to make those reads, to get a better understanding of where the talent is at, what things need to still be worked on, and get a bit of a timeline for when it's reasonable to expect Michael Morales to be at the best version of himself and what that may look like. Right now, that looks like it may be a contender, but he's 23. And so a lot can change in the next 5 years. Let's get him a couple more fights. Hopefully he can get 2 or 3 fights in this year. We can get a little bit more of a sample size. We can get a little bit more of a read. He looks good thus far. Let's just wait and see, though. Brings me to Belal Muhammad, who for me is the number one contender on merit, on everything. You go out and you stop Sean Brady at UFC 280 the way Belal did, you should be the number one contender. You should be facing Leon Edwards if he is without a dance partner currently for London. If Kamaru Usman can't fight on merit, on results, on performance, it should be Belal Muhammad. I would even argue on personality and in terms of just what they'd be able to market and sell, right? These guys fought already. It ended in a no contest because of an eye poke. Belal is a great personality. His show, Remember the Show, on YouTube with Jason Anik is a great, entertaining show. Tons of personality. He should be the number one contender. He should be facing Leon Edwards in March. 22-3 with 1 no contest overall. 13-3 with 1 no contest in the UFC. Undefeated in his last 9. Won 4 straight. What more does this dude need to do? And if you want to say, he's not a big enough name, he's not marketable, it's not going to change until you give him that opportunity. If people right now aren't excited for Belal Muhammad to be challenging for the welterweight title, given what he's done, given the performance he just had in October, that's not going to change with a win over anyone else in this division. And there shouldn't be many other people that he could possibly face. It's maybe 2 guys. It's maybe Chimaev and maybe Covington. And quite frankly, as much as I know Belal would take those fights, I don't think he needs to. He shouldn't have to. This is the thing we talk about all the time. Guys like this that are in this position shouldn't have to just keep going through the gauntlet when guys like maybe Jorge Masvidal are going to get title shots. If this is how it plays out, and I'm very seldom this guy, because look, I understand the reasons for doing Masvidal. But if that's how it plays out, and Belal has to go out and face Chimaev or Covington or someone further back than that, throw the rankings away. Don't even bother putting them out. He should be fighting for the title. Next up is Jeff Neal, who is a really interesting guy, and we'll get to that in a second. 32 years old, 15-4 overall, 6-2 in the UFC, won his last 2. Knocked out Vicente Luque last time out as an underdog, cashed on that one. Thank you, Jeff. Losses came back-to-back fights, Stephen Thompson and Neil Magny, and it was in a year. So the loss to Stephen Thompson was at the end of the year. In August of that year was the last fight of 2020. In August of that year, maybe 2019, can't remember. No, 2020, pandemic year. In August of that year, Jeff Neal was in the hospital with sepsis, nearly died. And so after the loss to Neil Magny, he said, look, I need to take some time. I need to reset. Since then, 2-0, looked great against Vicente Luque. He's facing Shavkat Rakhmonov. It is now scheduled for March at UFC 285. It was supposed to be next weekend. So I'm bummed out that it's not happening next weekend, but I'm glad that it's rebooked and it's not that far down the line. The thing that makes him super interesting that I teased just a second ago, I think Jeff Neal is an under the radar contender. I think people look at those losses and go, well, and they look at Luque having lost a couple fights and go, well, he's the last guy to beat Belal Muhammad. And he beat him, I don't want to say handily, because it wasn't like lopsided Belal was clobbered, but it was very clear that Jeff Neal won that fight. And he said after the win over Luque, like, I don't think Belal wants these problems again. And Belal didn't really respond. Jeff Neal's good. Jeff Neal's really, really good. And if he stops Shavkat Rakhmonov's run, he'll be in the title mix. Brings us to Michel Pereira. We talked about him a little bit earlier, facing Sean Brady on March 25th. Only 29 years old, 28-11 with 2 no contests overall, 6-2 in the UFC, won his last 5. So what I'm going to say next is a thing that pisses a lot of people off, but I don't care. And it's, thank God this man dialed back the crazy. Because since he dialed in the crazy, he's undefeated. He hit the UFC and he's doing the backflips and he's doing the rolling thunders and he's jumping off cages and all of that stuff. And it's cute and it's fun, and it worked out fine in his debut against Danny Roberts, and he knocked him out. Didn't work out at all in his second fight against Tristan Connolly. Didn't work out at all in his fight against Diego Sanchez, where he kneed him in the head when he was down and got disqualified. Knocked off all of that nonsense. Still has little flashes of it. Still pulls it out in bits and pieces, but is undefeated since. Because here's the thing. As much as he's entertaining as a wild man, he's really fucking good. Like if he stays technical and he fights technically, he's really good. He's huge for the division. He's a gigantic human being. How he makes 170 is unfathomable to me. He's gigantic. He still presents the chaos factor. He has good power. has good size, has good movement, all of those things. So to me, actually dialing it back and letting the crazy be a thing that you've got to worry about rather than the thing that you know you're going to get makes him more dangerous. If he goes out and lamps Sean Brady at the end of March to push this to 6 straight, he's in the top 10 and he's facing a legit name, a big name. This is what we wanted, was the wild man running up the ranks. It took not being as wild, but here we are. He's really interesting to me this year. That is a huge fight. I cannot wait for it. Let's see what Michel Pereira turns out to be when the smoke clears at the end of March. We move to Josh Quinlan, member of the class of 21 from Dana White's Contender Series, turns 30 in February, 6-0 overall, 1-0 in the UFC, KO'd Jason Witt in his debut with a nasty left hook. Just a nasty left hook. He's a guy for me that we still need a bunch more fights. We need 2-3 fights this year in order to get a real true read on where the ceiling, where the floor sits. Right? Beating Jason Witt tells us one thing. Great. Here's the baseline. No idea how good he can be, where this may go. Because he turns 30 next month, there's less of a reason to slow play him. Given all the guys that we've talked about, all the younger talent that we know is coming up, the guys that aren't 30 yet, slow play them a little bit. Get them, make sure we don't screw them up by rushing them too fast. Josh Quinlan's 30. Get him in there. Get him tested. Let's start this process of really, truly trying to figure out where the ceiling and the floor sit. It's a thing that the UFC, listen, it's difficult. I don't want to ever sound like all of this is easy. And if you just let me do it, it would be, no, it's hard. It's difficult to sort of find that right balance of who to fight when and who to match up where. And Sean Shelby and Mick Maynard do a very good job of it overall. Just would like to see somebody like Quinlan back in the mix a little sooner and getting a bit of a step up rather than being sort of that, oh, but he's Contender Series. We have to take it slowly and kid glove it a little. Get him in there. Let's find out. Let's see how far that power can carry him. See how good he truly is. Next up, Shavkat Rakhmonov. We have talked about him a couple of times here already. 28 years old, 16-0 overall, 4-0 in the UFC, finished everybody. Every single soul that has stood across from him has gotten finished. The last one to do that was Neil Magny. He was submitted in the second round. He is facing Jeff Neal in March. He looks like the real deal. I think we find out for sure this year. We all came into last year with Rakhmonov as one of our top prospects, and certainly the top prospect in this division, with all due respect to Ian Gary. Validated that. Carlston Harris win, Neil Magny win. Those are good wins. Puts him in the rankings. No longer a prospect. Now he is a contender. This year, I think we find out just how good of a contender he is. This feels to me similar to the year Islam Makhachev worked his way towards the top of the lightweight division, where it was like, okay, we know you're good. We know you've beaten a bunch of these dudes. Now let's see just how good it is. And I think he closed that year with a win over Drew Dober. And we were like, okay, yeah, I get it now. I think that's what Rakhmonov is in store for. We'll see if he can replicate that. We'll see if he can do the same thing and keep this unbeaten run going. I honestly and truly believe he could be in title contention by the end of the year. If he beats Jeff Neal, if he finishes Jeff Neal, there's only so many guys in front of him. And if you win that one, and we get to 18-0 and 6-0 in the UFC, and we're still all finishes, you just put him in there with the champ, or at least a number one contender. So I'd love to see 3 fights this year, and we'll see what the results are. That'll dictate where he gets to. Brings us to Phil Rowe, 32 years old, 10-3 overall, 3-1 in the UFC, a member of the class of 19 from the Contender Series. Lost his debut to Gabriel Green, won 3 straight since, all TKOs, good performances. He's got a good jab. He's got good reach. Could be kind of the the light beer version of Neil Magny, right? Big long reach, good grappler, moves well, good jab, could follow the Neil Magny blueprint and be just kind of a lesser version of Neil Magny. And I say lesser version just because Phil Rowe is already 32, not because he's incapable of getting to where Neil Magny has gotten. He just doesn't have as much runway, right? Neil Magny, I believe, is like 35 now, but has been in the UFC for a decade. So he had a number of years to work his way to where he is. Phil Rowe doesn't have the benefit of that. The other thing with Phil Rowe is that he just needs to stay focused. He's a guy that, for me, is a little too careless and a little too self-confident at times. He puts himself in some tricky spots. He's got the skills and the power that we've seen in these last couple fights to overcome that and be able to get away with that. But there's going to come a point where you're standing across from somebody that doesn't let you get away with it, that hits you, that puts you on skates, and doesn't let you find a way back. And so if he can keep it focused and keep it centered and just come out and fight the fights we see when he's having the good moments from Jump Street, he's a really interesting figure in this division. But we'll see if he can do that. Next up, Matthew Semmelsberger, 30 years old, 11-4 overall, 5-2 in the UFC. Unanimous decision win over Jake Matthews, as we talked about earlier, which is a good win. It's a good performance for Semi. He fought 3 times in 2021. He won a unanimous decision over AJ Fletcher in his first fight, lost Alex Morono in the second, and then beat Jake Matthews. And I think 2022 showed us a really good picture of where he's at in his development as a fighter. And I say in his development because he's only been a pro for 6 years. And I know that sounds like one of those, like, yeah, man, he's 30 though. Like, he's a really good athlete, former college football player, all of those things. He's still in a bit of a development phase. And he's behind a lot of these other people. And he doesn't have, similar to Phil Rowe, doesn't have as much runway. Needs to learn on the fly and grow more than other people in between each fight and take bigger steps. I think he's capable of it, though. You don't play D1 football and have NFL aspirations if you're not good at the athletic stuff. And we've seen that. He has freakish power. And as he keeps building that MMA understanding and that MMA IQ, I don't know that he becomes a top 15 guy. I don't think so. But he'll certainly settle in as a dangerous, I don't really want to fight the guy that earned 2 finishes in 16 seconds or less in 2021 kind of fighter. Jake Matthews probably, and we thought Jake Matthews was going to run through Matthew Semmelsberger. Maybe not finish him, but beat him handily. More class, more power, more polish, all of those things. Not more power, excuse me. More class, more polish, more experience, all of those things. And Semi was like, cool, right hands. And a couple lefts, but right hands. It's a great differentiator. And if he keeps developing, if we see the improvements that we saw from Morono to Matthews, go from Matthews to whoever's next, could keep winning some fights. Could become a little interesting. Couple more to go, including 2 very familiar names, the first of which is Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. 40 years old on February 11th, 17-6-1 overall, 12-6-1 in the UFC. Good win over Kevin Holland last time out, although I don't think it was quite as good as some people sort of are presenting it to be. Again, my position on Kevin Holland is well established. He wasn't included in this list. He's not somebody I'm looking for. I demand people watch. I want people to watch next year. If you want to, great. Not my cup of tea. The other part with Wonderboy, in addition to the age, is that the blueprint for beating him is pretty clear. Right? We saw it with Gilbert Burns. We saw it with Belal Muhammad. The 2 losses in his previous 2 to Kevin Holland. And so he's lost a step. He's still skilled. Still very good. He's in that similar position of, what do you want to be here? What do you want to be doing? Because if you're looking to still be a contender, and I believe he is, I think that he believes he can still challenge for gold. He's not far out in terms of where he is in the rankings and looking at the wins and losses and who he's faced. And so if you want to go that route, it's there for you. There could be some bad fights. There could be some bad looks here in 2023, if that's what we get. If he wants to go the Jim Miller route and decide, look, I still want to compete, but I can't hang with the absolute top end of this division, well, then there's some fun fights we can have, and we can all enjoy Stephen Wonderboy Thompson in his 40s. We're just going to have to see what comes to pass when he gets booked next. Because I think a win over Kevin Holland is going to get him somebody else in the top 15. We're going to have to be real. It's going to be really interesting to see who it is. That's all I'll say. I don't want to say we have to be careful because he looked good against Kevin Holland, but he's not the same guy that he was. Matchups are going to be important. Where he sees himself, where the UFC positions him, is going to dictate a lot of things in 2023. Brings us to the former champion, Kamaru Usman, turns 36 in May, 20-2 overall, 15-1 in the UFC. The reason we're watching, the reason we're paying attention, in addition to the skill, obviously, is how does that loss, how does that knockout impact things? What's his mentality? He wore it well coming away from the cage and coming away from that fight. Feel like there's a weight off my shoulders. Ready to enjoy this again. Having a good time. Love to see that. Does that carry over into the cage? Can you get that fire back? Can you get that killer instinct back? Can you get that? Do you fight with the same bravado and swagger and confidence that you did prior to getting knocked into the shadow realm? A minute away from tying Anderson Silva's record for the most consecutive victories in UFC history? We'll see. The other thing that's interesting for me, as always with Kamaru Usman, is that there just seems to always be little lingering, nagging injuries that limit his appearances. So we saw him at his event in Africa with a splint on his hand, like lower hand, not a full, but lower hand. So not a cast, just covering up a couple fingers, I believe it was. So that seems like he's not going to be ready to go for March for an immediate rematch, which as a guy that, had won 15 straight and defended the title several times, certainly entitled to if he is healthy and that is what he would like to do. But we're going to have to see because he could end up, what he's done, what he accomplished to me merits an immediate rematch, merits a shot at the champion, whoever that is, whenever he's ready to go. If he wants to do otherwise, if the UFC wants to do otherwise, I totally understand. That's up to them. They can make that decision. It's going to be interesting to see what happens and when it happens. Because the more time that elapses, a little bit older, we'll see. We'll see. It's going to be really interesting. Close things out with Jeremiah Wells, who, like me, was born on October 30th. He is 36. I am not 36. He's 11-2-1 overall, 3-0 in the UFC, all finishes. He is part of that Philly-based Daniel Gracie crew, and we don't talk about him enough. We just don't. Stoppage wins over Warlley Alves and Court McGee mean you get a step up in competition in my books. And yes, 36 years old is way older than we're going to get to for like ascending talents and not sure where they fit and up and coming. There's no part of that man that looks, feels, acts, operates 36. He's only got 14 fights. Still really explosive, really powerful, really athletic. The knockout of Court McGee was the first time Court has been put all the way out. You don't do that if you're not big power. And you don't beat Warlley Alves on short notice in your debut if you're not skilled, if you're not good. Let's get this dude to step up in competition and see what we got here. Again, older guy, no need for the slow play. Get him in there with Ponzinibbio. Get him in there with Alex Morono. Someone of that status. And let's just see. That's it for the welterweights. Again, like I said off the top, not a big class, but a really condensed, talent-rich class. Really, really talented group. Going to be a lot of cool stories emerging from this division, I think, in 2023. Biggest one of all, biggest couple, right? Who's the title fight? Who's Leon Edwards defend against first? What's Hamzat doing? Is Colby Covington coming back? How good is Shavkat? What about Jeff Neal? So much to think about. Can't wait till we get into it. We are 7 days away. I'm taping this on Saturday, so we are 7 days away from the first event of the year. I'm starting to get pumped. I hope you are as well. I hope you're enjoying this series. Check us out tomorrow when we get into the middleweight division, Sean Sheehan's favorite division in the UFC. Until then, be good to yourselves. Be good to one another. Know that you're loved. Know that we appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon.